Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about no thought in everyday life. This topic came up because of requests and questions I've gotten from people who, through meditation, being present, mindful, vipassana, self-inquiry, all these different ways of avenues of stilling the mind is the end result. That when they're physically still, seated, laying down, whatever, thought stops. And they're like, yeah, I notice that I don't think when I'm physically still, seated, lying down, whatever. But then the question is, well, how do I do this the rest of the time? It's like as soon as I start moving, I lose it. How do I do this in work? How do I do this doing chores, being a parent, whatever? Throughout the day, I can't seem to do it. Don't I need thought? And I will say there is an implication that, people imply when they question this, that they almost think thought is required to act. Thought is not required to act. A drummer, when I'm drumming on my hand drums, I'm not thinking. As soon as I start thinking is when I start losing the rhythm, getting out of sync, screwing up the pattern, whatever. It's when you're not thinking you play your best. Likewise, any athlete in the zone will say, in this moment of very profound awareness without thought, I just act. I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do. I'm not wondering if I'll make it or any of the implications. I just act. And as soon as you try to think, it throws you out of the zone and you're caught up in thought again. And I want to use this as a proof that you don't need thought. Think about driving. Most of my viewers, I think, are over the age of mid-20s. And so hopefully most people have about at least a decade of driving experience. But for people who've been driving for a decade or more, if not decades, you might not recall what it was like when you first started learning how to drive. Now, when my daughter was learning how to drive, it reminded me because it was nothing but thought, and she was even verbalizing it a lot of times to me. She's like, am I close enough to the car, or am I too far from the car, or should I be further away from the car? She's forgetting, oh yeah, I got to keep remembering to look at the mirrors, speed, got to look at the speedometer, make sure I'm going the right speed, all this stuff. And it's just thought, trying to keep track of everything. And when you first learn how to drive, it was very mentally intensive. You were thinking all the time, am I far enough? Am I going fast enough? Or am I going too slow? What's going on around me? It's just constant, thinking about driving to the point where it was almost hard to get to your destinations because you didn't have much bandwidth to think about where you're going. All your attention was just on trying to drive. But, for people who've been driving for decades, when you're driving, notice you're not thinking about driving. You just automatically have the appropriate distance from the driver in front of you. More often than not, you're driving the speed limit without having to look at the speedometer constantly. You don't need to think about your distance from the curb when you're turning. You're able to just drive without having to think about how to drive and have this constant mental chatter monitoring all the stuff that I'm doing. Am I doing it right? Am I too close? Did I remember this? Did I remember that? None of that's going on. And when you're driving, you might find that there is no thought involved in driving. It just happens. And all activity can be like this. It does require a fair amount of trust and your own understanding that you know what to do. For athletes, when they're in the zone, it's stuff that they know how to do. They've practiced it enough where they just know how to do it. There's an inner wisdom. There's a deep understanding beyond the mind. They can shoot the ball or do whatever without needing to think about it. Drummers, you have to be, or any instrument, but you have to have played long enough that it is ingrained in the body, in the understanding that I know how to do this without having to think about it. And in that way, that gives you a clue on how all activity can go that way. But if at the moment you're only able to just be without thought when you're physically still, the question is, well, how do I go from there? Well, there is walking meditation. So usually the first thing I recommend is to get up and slowly walk, trying to still stay inwardly still and silent. Inwardly you're still and silent, but you're also 100% fully devoted to the feeling and experiencing of the moment while walking. And in this way, you may learn how to be present, mindful, meditate while walking. And very soon you would be able to take walks in nature. That would be just as much of a meditation as if you were seated in some quiet room. There wouldn't be a difference. It would be the same still, silent, full awareness. And then once you're able to walk in this way, you can start doing other very simple, repetitive physical patterns. Let's say you don't have a dishwasher, and so you're washing a dish. Well, that can become very meditative. Just wash a dish. Rinse a dish and put it down, and then take the next one. Wash a dish. And you're just fully engrossed in that. That's all you're doing. You're just washing a dish. Fully aware, not even thinking. And that's how you can expand upon that. And as you do this, you can get increasingly more complex patterns, but take it slow. I mean, if you've got walking down, if you have a lawn, as you're pushing the lawnmower, it's a walking meditation. The loud mower in front of you doesn't matter. The vibrations, that's just something else to experience. The noise, just something else to be aware of and experience. And so you can do a walking meditation while you're pushing a lawnmower and meditate while mowing. And so you can mow without thought. And like I said, then you have washing dishes, folding clothes, just folding towels, just doing your thing. You don't need to think about it. It's simple things. You know how to do it without having to think about how to do it. And as you're doing this, it is retraining, or at least putting a new pattern within the brain to say, well, when there's no thought, you don't need to fill it up with stuff. You don't need to fill it up with thought and think. You can just allow it to be silent. And it may become easier to just be without thought in simple activities. And it can just keep going from there. I mean, when I'm working during the day, I've been in this profession over 20 years of working in HR as a recruiter. I don't need to think as I'm looking at resumes. If I'm looking for a certain skill set, there's certain keywords that I might be looking for in resumes as I'm reviewing resumes, and no thought is needed. It's just a matter of pulling up the resume, reviewing it quickly, and just trying to spot the keywords. Either they're spotted or they're not. And as you go through the resume, based on the number of caught keywords, depending on the technologies or whatever, I might put it off to the side for a more in-depth review. And it doesn't require thought. I don't need to think about things. I don't need to think about, because I know what I'm looking for. And I'm just allowing the eye to look for those words. When I'm writing posts online, I'm not thinking about what I'm going to write. If I'm replying to a comment on this channel or online on Quora or whatever, I'm not planning on what I'm going to write. I'm not mentally deliberating and having this dialogue of what am I going to write and is it going to sound right. I just start writing, and it comes out of silence. It comes out of silence of mind. There's no thought behind it. It just comes up. Kind of like when you're playing with drums. I might have a pattern, and the pattern, I might just decide to change the pattern. As long as it's the same beat, say it's a 4/4 beat, and you go from one 4/4 beat to another 4/4 beat. So it's the same time, and so you can transition from one beat to the other with very little effort. I don't need to think about how am I going to do this transition? How am I going to get the timing right? And because if I start thinking about how I'm going to get this done, it gets in the way and I flub up the transition. But if you go with the feel of it, you're going with the flow in a way. You don't have to think. It's the transition happens and you change from one beat to the other without really thinking about it. Now, I'm not saying no thought ever arises. It's not like there's a rule that thou shalt never think, because thought does have its place in life. If I'm going into a meeting with a manager to find out where they are with a candidate, I might, before the meeting, look up my notes and think about where we left off. Has the candidate gotten back to me? Was the manager told me so far? And kind of go over what has been done, and at the same time, future plan where we need to be. And then I'll be prepared for the call. That's fine. It doesn't take long. It takes a few minutes to basically go, okay, this is where I was, this is what I did, this is where we gotta be, this is where I gotta talk with the manager. Now I'm done with my planning. And now thought just falls away again because it's not needed. But I would say, the predominant normal day-to-day world is silent mind. There's not a lot of thought. I'm not even thinking now. I'm not planning on what I'm talking about. I'm not thinking about what I'm talking about. It's happening spontaneously, moment to moment. It's arising from silence in the moment spontaneously. I'm not trying to plan it. I'm not deliberating it. I'm not thinking in the back of my head, does this sound right, or does it sound off? None of that is happening. There's no dialogue, there's no mental chatter, there's no planning, there's no deliberation. It just arises. And so it's possible to let all that chatter fall away. And one day it might hit the point where you're able to do your job to, in this silent mind without thought much of the time. You might find I don't really need to think that much in my job. There's times thought might be involved, but much of the time thought doesn't really need to be involved. And then even if your job did have a lot of thought, it's not like you're thinking constantly. There might be a quick coffee break. There might be a meeting, meeting in particular. If you're not leading the meeting, well, you don't need to think then. You just need to be fully aware and fully with what's going on. After work, you go to the car or the bus stop. You don't need to think at this point. You're just going to the car or the bus stop. And then if you're driving home, like I said, you already know how to drive. You don't need to think about anything. You just drive without thinking, no thought. And in this way, everyday life is without thought increasingly. It does require, perhaps, for those that have where there's still a me believed. See, the vast majority of thoughts revolve around a me. They're self-reflective. They're self-reflexive thoughts, compulsive. And so when the illusion of the me shatters, when the me can no longer be believed, many of these thoughts fall away. And so there's a much more profound silence. But if the me is still believed, even then, through practice, you can find a more constant, thoughtless living without thought, a more silent mind standpoint. Because thought really isn't needed much of the time. Probably 95% or more of the thoughts we have simply aren't needed. And so what you're doing when you're getting up from the cushion or the couch or whatever, and you're trying to practice this in motion, say walking, and then simple activities like washing dishes, is you're just trying to expand the amount of time that you spend not thinking. And the more activities that you can integrate into not thinking, like when you're driving somewhere, you don't need to think. You don't need to be thinking about anything while you're driving. You're driving. Just be totally with that. 100%. I'm driving. Not to get anywhere, so I'm not thinking about, the destination constantly and, needing to get through traffic and causing stress, because that's all future oriented, but just being with the I'm traveling and enjoy the journey. It's a different mindset. Or if you're in the bus and on the way home, if you're sitting in the bus, just sit in the bus and enjoy the trip home, but fully aware. Look around. What's going on? It doesn't need to be filled up with thought because you're not doing something. And in that way, it's possible to be without thought or have no thought in everyday life. It just is something that increases. And I think actually becomes more of the normal state when awakening or enlightenment shatters the illusion of me, because then all that self-reflexive thought, that habitual, conditioned, compulsory, self-reflexive thought falls away. But anyways, if you got any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.